I'm gonna step in here. This is
Go for it.
okay. Well, right, good afternoon and welcome to the Department of Environment and Sustainability's seminar this afternoon. We shall have Dr. Mechtenberg, Abigail Mechtenberg, who is an assistant teaching professor at Notre Dame in the physics department. She's also an energy affiliated faculty member and has research students in physics education research as well as energy and sustainable development. Prior to that, she was at Colgate University, where she was a physics assistant professor. Education started with a BS in physics from Texas A&M, went on to get a master's in educational psychology at the University of California, an MS in physics at the University of Michigan, followed by a PhD in applied physics at the University of Michigan, and a postdoctoral appointment in mechanical and electrical engineering at the University of Michigan. She leads and actively participates in national and international activities that support the university's mission, including AAPT, APS, UN Sustainable Energy for All, NARUC, and more. Today, she will be considering the question, was the 1970s an energy crisis? And are there human rights violations happening during today's energy crisis? From healthcare during electricity failures to sustainable risk design. She will talk about these topics and solutions not currently explored for Hicks and Limix energy solutions. What Hicks and Limix?
I don't know. I think that was maybe a typo, but thank you. No, it's low to middle income countries
Oh,
and high income countries.
Hicks.
Yes, that's hilarious. Thank you so much. Welcome everyone. So for today, I am going to give a brief introduction to myself. So a lot of times people in sustainability, we come from various backgrounds. And so it's important to kind of situate yourself within your own background to kind of have people in the audience understand and know what your overall paradigm is that you're coming from. I had an anthropologist on my PhD thesis. And one of the things when you take a lot of anthropology classes that you learn is you begin to learn and understand that there is nothing really called objective. We like to think in science and engineering and mathematics that we can be objective. And actually that can give us a false sense of security in terms of what we're studying as being the most important thing to study. And more importantly, that we have validity that we do not need to question. And I will argue today in terms of energy justice and what I'm talking about today. And this is going to be my first conversation on energy justice. My colleague, Dr. Susan Clark, she had me give talks on my research to her class for the last 2 years remotely with COVID, and then invited me to come here. Thank you, Dr. Clark. And the students gave her a lot of feedback that they really liked my talk, but they thought I should be framing it from an energy justice perspective. And so I've been thinking about it, and this is my first talk on energy justice. So in terms of me and the fact that I understand that I am not objective, I'm going to describe what my frame is and the lens at which I approach this research question. And so part of what I do are academic publications in design and control optimization for power management, specifically looking at objective functions and how our values are embedded within our objective functions. Again, we like to think that we are objective, hence the word objective functions. And I have one particular research paper, which I will not go over today, but highlights this idea that we should be questioning the objective functions we look at and really exploring that space. Taylor's functions we do, I'll give just a little tidbit on that. When we learn Taylor's functions in calculus and then bring it into engineering and business and economics and other courses, we like to say the sum of all parts equals the whole. And if you know anything about design science, you know anything about data science and complex systems analysis, you know that the sum of parts do not equal the whole. In fact, other emerging behavior can come out. And from that, if you go back and think about it, there's actually a really interesting transformation from a summation series with Taylor's expansion to a product. And so you can rewrite every function you do as a product. And so some of the objective functions talk about what is it if we look at a product versus a sum? How does that change our engineering design? Turns out it can really change our engineering design. My colleague, I'm also at Kettering University as a visiting scholar this year, and she and I have a publication that we're wrapping up right now that goes through that in terms of energy power management for a hybrid vehicle. The other academic publications are energy and sustainable development. And so looking at electricity availability, reliability, affordability, and maintainability, and with a focus on microgrids and specifically on healthcare, as well as some on education, and I'll talk a little bit about that today. I've worked on empower energy design and specifically on sustainable risk design, so working with design communities, and I'll talk a little bit about that today. And then I've developed a lot of energy curriculum. You know, there's a lot of energy crises going on, which I'll talk about today. And we don't talk about them as energy crises necessarily. And I believe because we haven't talked about them as energy crises, we're potentially not doing full justice to the energy curriculum that we could be doing. And so I worked on physics curriculum from an energy perspective, given talks at the American Association for Physics Teachers, and done different workshops. So I'm an educator working in energy policy. I'm an engineer. I love to build things and work with people on building things, but I'm actually trained as a nerdy physicist. And so these are some of my research publications at different intersections of these fields. This picture in the middle is me on top of the roof of Burica Hospital installing a weather station and a power load monitor to measure the grid and diesel failures at a hospital over a year. All right, so for today, we're going to talk about research on electricity crises and sustainable risk design. One of the things that I like to really point out is our research is not about us. Our research is about the community and collaborators that we bring together. And so for me, some of my academic collaborators are here listed. Academic institutions that my collaborators come from: University of Notre Dame, Makerere University, University of Rwanda, Institute of Haitian Dialogue. I'm not very good at pronouncing in Creole, forgive me. Federal University of Technology, Mina, Nigeria, Mountains of the Moon University in Uganda, Ugandan Small Scale Industry Association, Uganda Martyrs University, and Harvard University, as well as hospitals, Mulago Hospital, Burica Hospital. I've worked with Bosch International and a lot with Homer Energy. Industry, those are some of the industry partners. Providing funding is listed, and you know, one of the difficult things about doing some of this research is figure out and navigating how to make it successful, even though other people don't necessarily consider it important. And I'll talk about that as a justice issue, because what we view as important is what we fund. And if we don't view something as important, we don't fund it. And so I have been very creative in how I have looked at this. In fact, for example, the National Science Foundation gave funding for a research collaborative network, but they did not want funding me to spend the money in Uganda buying steel, because we're supposed to buy from US companies, which is fine. So I went ahead and bought a bunch of Legos, $10,000 worth of Legos. And then I created energy camps for rich kids in the US. And then I would run these energy camps with my research students, and we would make a ton of money, because it turns out that a physics faculty member is teaching kids, parents will pay upward of $1,000 per child. And at the end of the week, when they've learned all this energy, some parents have even written checks. So, you know, there's lots of ways to be entrepreneurial and to still have your research that you believe in funded. All right, so in terms of the Human Development Index, not the best index, but it's an index of education, healthcare, economics. It goes from 0 to 1. So 1 is, you know everything, you're rich, and you live forever, okay? 0 is you die at birth, you have no money, and you don't know anything. So I have switched the axis, so 0 is on top and 1 is in the bottom. So what you'd like to be doing is you would like to be on the lower left quadrant, where you are not consuming that much electrical power, and you are very rich, very smart, and you live a really long time. So the low life expectancy frontier is there in the green. And so those are all the countries and kind of where they are in terms of the Human Development Index and the average electrical power consumed in terms of watts per capita. Now, it's really important to know this and understand this watts per capita, because if I put this line of 100 watts per capita up here, or that dotted bottom orange line is, that's under human power. So all of these countries are under human power for their entire country, which is huge. And as you get away from human power, there's another set of like 500 watts per person. All right. And then after that, there is this nice, and there's a famous paper on 1 kilowatt per person, which I happen to really love that paper. Above 1 kilowatt per person, you're usually getting into that particular country. So these are countries, the circle is the size of the population. Those particular countries are typically doing industrial work. And so they're consuming a lot. But that consumption, it can be due to inefficiencies, like running a lot of hot tubs would be the joke I tell my students. There's not much benefit to your education, to your economics, or to your lifespan necessarily. And so, or I should say statistically, but you like to do it and you use that electricity for that. However, these are not necessarily in that situation. A lot of these countries are doing, aluminum smelting or something associated, which requires a lot of energy. And so the size of the bubbles is the population, and then the color is life expectancy at birth. And so it's nice to kind of see the color that kind of pops out as you think about the relationship and the kind of variables involved in human development and average electrical power consumed. I have lots of versions of these types of plots because I'm visual and I like to really think about these in a visual way. As an engineer looking at Pareto curve efficiencies or whatever, you really want to be in that lower left, but it's a little bit misleading because Human Development Index of 0 is awful. So even if you're consuming a lot less electricity, you definitely do not want to be anywhere on that line. You want to be as close to inside, away from that axis on the lower left as possible. And so there are a lot of different ways to look at this, but someone was proposing something to me, and I said, no, let me look at the data a different way. And as soon as I showed that particular group, everyone has their silo. Everyone likes to look at data in a different way. And now when I showed them the data in this way, it was like a light bulb came on because of the field that they were in. I showed the data in a different way to surgeons. So John Holdren, one of the premier famous climate change activists and looking at climate change and the responses, wrote, there are 3 responses to climate change. Mitigation. Everyone talks about mitigation. Adaptation. Lots of people talk about adaptation. And suffering. And I decided I wanted to consider, what does it mean academically to consider the concept of suffering in climate change? What are we going to be doing about suffering? How are we going to navigate and discuss suffering? And so when you look at Kevin Carter's Pulitzer Prize picture with a vulture and someone and a young child really just not able to walk anymore due to hunger, you think about this idea of suffering due to food shortages. We think about suffering, and the way in which we go about quantifying it matters. When you think about action, and we need people to act, we need people to act now. It's important the ways in which we look at visualizing data and the way we tell our story. Because where we tell our story, we can resonate, and we can get more action. And I'm not saying that this is the perfect story. It's by far not the perfect story, but it is a story that I think is about resiliency, and I think about looking at a pathway where we're being honest with what we can do while being empowering of that we can do more. And so in electricity failures, there are two, or in general for suffering criteria. So I first looked at animal rights violations. There needs to be something that is a measurable damage, and it needs to be able to be avoided. Okay, so if it can't be avoided, then that's not necessarily suffering. It may be suffering in a different way in which you want to discuss it. Those who are in English or philosophy might define it in a different way, but I'm going through through animal rights in this particular paper and looking at, if you already know you are going to potentially suffer because, or an animal is going to suffer, how can you measure that suffering? And can you decrease that suffering a little bit? And if you can decrease it, then that level of suffering you were previously doing is actually avoidable suffering, because now I can still execute and still go through the same thing that I planned to go through, or that I had to go through, I was forced to go through. That is the reality of the situation. But now I can avoid it a little bit, and I can actually physically measure that. So getting away from the pictorial representations and into the actual scientific being able to measure it. So if we think about reliability and the electricity damage that can be defined as unmet load, we're at a hospital, there's a particular load, and we need to execute medical procedures, and the grid goes out. Diesel generator fails. Sun, it's been raining a lot, batteries are depleted. The load is now not met, it's unmet. And we can now measure that. This is unmet load. And then the suffering criteria would be, could we have avoided that unmet load? And which one of the loads could we have avoided? And if so, this is starting to get to the idea of suffering. And I will argue that when you look at suffering, it's actually very strongly related to justice. Just like animal rights violations in terms of how we go about killing cattle developed out of this, I would say this is a human rights issue as well. And there are other people talking about that as well. So one of the things I looked at is healthcare clinics. And there, you can do this in all scales. I just have one scale that's based off of a paper in Iraq. So I reproduced the paper and then did Monte Carlo simulations from that in terms of the solar and the power load, and then just looked overall what the different design sizes were. In every single situation, if you accept a 20% capacity shortage, you can save 50%. So that sounds reasonable, right? A lot of people design energy systems where they say, well, at least 80% of the time I will have electricity. And so there's a big bang for your buck. Economists will tell you that that's a great design particular point. You know, you've still got a great bang for your buck, I think is the discussion. But from my perspective as suffering, that 20% of the time that you're failing, there needs to be an investigation of that and a discussion, because we are talking about lives. And would this discussion be different if we included the value of a statistical life? And so my next paper after this investigation looked at that as well. So this is the decrease in costs. And so cost savings of 50% if you accept a 20% failure rate. So solar panels and batteries are still doing 80%. So here's an example of only a 5% failure. This is at Verica Hospital. Again, I'm on that roof of that hospital. And this is real voltage and current measurements, 15-minute intervals, but then I looked at it for hour by hour. And so the electricity had to fail for an hour to be an actual failure event. And I measured the power load. And so I had not only the power load data throughout the year, but I also had the failure events. And so just so you know, the grid comes in, electric grid, and then the electricity goes out into the theater ward, which is the surgical ward, and they have a backup diesel fuel. And I had actually given them a backup hand crank generator for being able to see at night, which they locked up and etched in and really talked a lot about it being useful. Now, for all those failures, you can then say, what was the power load before that failure? What was the power load after that failure? And you can average the two and say, what was the expected power load in between? There are lots of different ways to do that. That's the methodology I chose at the time. And then you can look at all the hours of the year and you can say, okay, how many failures were, and given different expected average power values throughout the entire year. And so you can see that there are failures in the 0 to 0.05 kilowatt range. There are failures between the 0.3 to 1 kilowatt range. And so I kind of broke them up into groupings that you can kind of start to see a histogram or some sort of groupings of the failures. So I would argue that the large percentage of these failures are avoidable unmet loads. And some of these were associated to patients' deaths. And there were I'll give you one example. I was in the children's ward getting the power load data of all the medical devices, and there was a little boy on an oxygen concentrator. And he was just, really full of energy. And his mother was just like, keep the mask on, keep the mask on. So I just started talking to her and the nurse, and it was a wonderful conversation. I really smiled a lot at this little boy full of energy. The next day when I came in to start on the theater ward, I had finished with the children's ward. I saw the mom in the morgue, and I went back to the nurse. Obviously, I didn't talk to her. And I said, what happened? He was so full of energy. It turns out that the grid, it was the dry season. So hydroelectric is the predominant energy source, and they cannot provide power for the entire country. So different cities will get different power at different times. And this particular city did not get power throughout the night. And they had a backup diesel generator, but it's very cost prohibitive, upwards of $11 per kilowatt hour to run a diesel generator. So they have choices to make. They did provide solar panels for lighting, but solar panels were not powerful enough, nor were the enough batteries to power the oxygen concentrator. I then went back to where I was staying and just calculated, as any physicist would, how many magnets and coils did I need, and how much power could human muscles did. And then it generated a paper on human power for countries that are under 20 watts per capita. And I would say for any event where there is an emergency situation here, even in the US, or if you're camping, lots of people have hand crank generators. But I will also argue that an elliptical machine, because a simple elliptical machine in Hong Kong at exercise gyms, they have the elliptical machines that can actually power the entire gym from people who are actually paying them to have access to the elliptical machine. So there are things we can do in this space that we're not even considering. There are no designs for considering that. Most designs come from generators, solar panels, wind turbines, biogas generators. This is what people are talking about. So what else could we be talking about? We could be talking about the hand crank, as I mentioned, for lighting. The batteries do deplete of energy. And so even though they have solar, it ends up being dark. We could be talking about a bicycle generator. We could be talking about an exercise generator, a cattle go round generator, like milling, old time milling. Farmers are actually always looking for ways to make money from their cattle besides killing them and selling them for food. It's incinerator, steam generator. People are already incinerating a lot to clean off and the medical equipment. We could be looking at solar collectors instead of solar panels. And we could, most importantly, I'm very interested in biogas generators, locally built and maintained. And so when you look at this, you can say, okay, well, let's go through this. We have 100 watts per person, extreme vent, 1 kilowatt. How does someone normally look at it? They look at all these different levelized costs of electricity and failure rates, and they kind of put a system together. And there are lots of different ways to kind of take these different systems and the levelized cost of electricity and the failure rate and put them together to make a more resilient system. All right, so these are things are done, and they can think about, the fact that the failure rate is really, really high and levelized cost of electricity is low, and we could do this system or we could do that. There's lots of trade-offs that you can look in design of energy systems. But before going into all of that for your power load throughout the day and the different ways in which you could prioritize your loads, So 50 watts, some lights, 100 watts, a very, very small oxygen concentrator, and then overall your small healthcare facility. But we'll look at just Verica Hospital for an example. So they have the grid coming in, goes through some transformer. Every place has backup batteries. In fact, the administration is really funny because they're not supposed to have their own backup batteries at their workstation. But they would say, oh yeah, I have my backup battery because I'm not losing everything I typed in on my computer just because the electricity failed. So there are batteries throughout the system already. And so, when the grid comes back on, one thing that is interesting, I'll say, is that if you're not careful, one of the reasons people, when the grid goes off, they immediately turn off all of the systems, even if they can run a backup and then run off batteries, is because the grid is very dangerous when it turns back on, and it can destroy medical equipment. So if you look at this particular system, they had already in place diesel fuel hand crank. They had a small solar at the children's ward. They had another small solar at the maternity ward. And they have a medium-sized solar for the laboratory. And that was basically for being able to measure blood and to have refrigerated blood and some vaccines. And so this is what they had. What we could do with systems that could be locally built with a sustainable risk design involved, still use these systems that they already have, but then think about adding other backup systems, right? Again, it's this idea of we have avoidable unmet loads. Patients are dying. And so what can we do? Where would we do it? Does this make sense? And this is just a graphical representation of that bubble, that bullet list, I would say. And just to really realize that this isn't just words. This is an example of a real hospital and what they really could do. And then obviously, as you increase it and you increase the size of it, you could put in 2 controllers, and you can actually then be able to send electricity through the grid, through resilient networks, and being able to have all these microgrids. And I will say that in terms of the leapfrog ability, places in sub-Saharan Africa have DC and AC grids already. In the US, we have all AC. So a lot of their systems are DC, and they could go back and forth AC and DC much easier than we can right now. And in the US, this comes up. I won't be talking about this here, but we should really be thinking about what we can do in our own homes and our own hospitals to do some DC microgrids. Okay, so is this possible? Yes. First, we define the possibility. Then we need to talk about maintainability, reliability, resilience, and then argue it is absolutely necessary for energy justice. Why is it important for energy justice? I'll get to that at the end. So, is it possible? My colleague, Dr. Moses Mzazi, he really, in a paper that he and I worked together on, has a lot of amazing innovations. He's since passed away from lung cancer, but worked a lot on changing the perspective of design, where people are not just designing for the other 90%, which was the first language that came out in 2007. And then people started arguing about that and saying, look, you know what, you can't really do things for people. Like, that's really problematic to design with the other 90%. But what we're really talking about in sustainable risk design is we need to empower people locally to design by themselves. There has to be local technicians. There has to be local and global have to work together. And this is not just economically, this must be done in design and specifically for risk design. Designing for the fact we are going to fail, and it's a matter of when and how severely we're going to fail. And we already do have minor failures, in some places more major failures, but what does it look like to address those risks and to start designing and to start thinking about having everyone be a designer? Now, one of the things that's important for maintainability is a curriculum pedagogy. So this is pictures of things where we actually make electricity generating devices. And then we go from these little small, kind of what people would call in the design world, you really do design things, prototype things, get the spatial relationships correct and the overall understanding down. And then you can actually say, okay, let's make. So this is the curriculum from mechanical to electrical. This is the curriculum from thermal to mechanical to electrical. This is the curriculum from chemical to thermal to mechanical to electrical. And this is the putting them together into the microgrids. So maintainability, we really need to be thinking about our curriculum and thinking about how we go about teaching this and empowering this so that energy is throughout. I've been working with physics education community for a while, and I've been arguing that physicists we are really able to teach energy throughout our curriculum if we did, and so could chemists and so could biologists. But if physicists could be doing it in a clear way. So I have a curriculum for changing physics to be able to do this. This particular curriculum in Uganda and in the US looks at books and lectures, prototyping to design, again, that whole design world thinking, and then design to build, which is probably my favorite stage, and then test and modify, which is always the annoying stage, then deploy to a customer, fix, sometimes go back to test and modify, and then once the customer is really happy, looking at creating a business venture. And this is just a picture of the watts per capita throughout the world. So sometimes when you see that graph, you think, oh, well, there's a lot of countries that are above 1,000 watts per person. But if you graphically look at this, there are a lot of geographical, spatial groups of countries that are below, 300 or so watts per capita. So this actually affects a large group of people. And the people who are under 300 watts per capita, these are going to be places that have, especially in the rural areas, high unreliability, but even in the urban areas, they deal with unreliability. So this is the way that it works. We have what's called an energy dream team, and it looks like some of the formatting that's a little bit off on this. That's okay. But you have people already in existence in the US, in Uganda, throughout the world, who are auto mechanics, electricians, solar technicians, welders, metal fabricators, rewinders, weavers, plumbers, masons, and business managers. If you get them together and you start through this sustainable risk design, you say, hey, by the way, people are dying in the in hospitals. Like, we need to start having solutions. I love the Hollywood movie about Katrina and the fact they put diesel generators in the basement and they flooded. Obviously, we don't like the fact that people died due to putting generators in the basement and flooding. But that particular movie highlights the fact that the only solution for the actor, the father of his child in an incubator, was a hand crank generator. And the most unrealistic part of the entire Hollywood movie is that a hand crank generator would exist at these hospitals. They don't exist. It's not happening. So if you think about putting a team together and you say, wow, we know there are going to be risks. We know that there's going to be suffering due to climate change. There already is. Katrina's one example. There are lots of examples throughout the low to middle income countries. What do you need in that energy dream team? You definitely need a new curriculum. You definitely need engineering design, and you definitely need entrepreneurship. How are we going to go about and make a business from this? And so then that's the graphical stages that we've done and implemented in Uganda and Rwanda. These are some of the pictures of the design devices that have been built and tested. A lot of people told me that this can't be done. I've heard everything under the sun and more, I would probably say, and that's just not true. It can. We have absolute brilliance. I really believe in the human brain, and I really believe in neurological research that design actually and creativity heals trauma. And if for no other reason, we should be doing sustainable risk design, because people are creating real solutions for real people. And it has the ability to heal trauma, which is very important. I'll give one example, which is really funny in terms of design and this tension that I have to navigate sometimes. The merry-go-round generator in the middle where kids run around on the generator. This was first documented in the literature done by Brigham Young University. They would make it at BYU, and then they would ship it 7,000 miles to Ghana, or however far it is, not 7,000, it was $7,000. However the distance is, they put on a plane, fly it there. $7,000 to make this. I think they brought it down to like $2,000 or $3,000. And I was like, that's ridiculous. Who can pay for that? So they had a whole system. And there's a lot of examples in engineering design of people doing various different solutions for people. We could build it in Uganda for $700 with everyone making 5 standard deviations of increased income. 5 standard deviations increased income it's still very poor by US standards in terms of income for the technicians, but it's an incredible game changer for their economics. So when you look at that, okay, so we have so much money going in to create solutions that look really, really cool on paper, and we can get a ton of funding for it. But we can actually already do that there. So when you think about Black Lives Matter, for example, and I would say Black Careers Matter, which careers are we funding? Now, some people here may really not like that, but I want to say this is the generation of let's really undo any wrongs that we might have done in the past. And let's ask the hard questions and not be offended by asking them. Is there a way to make engineering design more just? One way to consider engineering design more just is by giving the design tools and equipment there in there, and specifically sustainable risk design, so they can design solutions for the risks that they have to deal with every single day. All right, so then people start asking, oh, but how do you make real power? Well, this is how the curriculum goes in terms of power. You have gravity and hand crank generators. Sewing machine generator is one that they created. There's a lot of people who sew. And so they changed the design so it would go with the sewing machine. So every time they hit the pedal, they also charge their cell phone. So now they diversified their business portfolio, because now not only was their business sewing, their business is also charging a cell phone. Bicycle generator, then you start going up to table generator. So imagine you're at a school or at a bar and you want to run your laptop and the electricity is off. Underneath the table, you have a little bike, and it's very easy to power your cell phone and your laptop. In fact, you can even power a printer. Merry-go-round generator, cattle-go-round generator. The next size up is the horizontal axis wind turbine or the vertical axis wind turbine hydroelectric generator. Obviously, you can make those quite large. I think the limit that we run into is the size of gauge of wire, copper wire we can get, and what we can actually build in the shop. And we do import in magnets, the permanent magnets in there. The next size is the cogen cook stove. So while you're cooking, you charge cell phones, basic thermal electric, then waste incinerator, solar power collectors. And so then you go to biogas and biodiesel, and you put those together and you start looking at microgrids, and the hospital now becomes not something that's just being used for backup energy. Now the hospital can sell the energy to the electric grid. And so now you can start having back and forth and start really talking about this smart grid innovation. So that's the overall pathway. Why does it matter if this is possible? And I will say it matters because of justice, as I mentioned before, and in 2 different ways. One, because people are dying in hospitals. I'm about to transition to that discussion. And 2, because in engineering design, we spend a lot of money sending our students there, designing for them, importing systems there. That is money that can actually stay in their community and can actually be empowering them to be part of the solution. And then we can work together collaboratively to actually solve climate change. So here's an example of the original energy crisis on the left. So the energy crisis in the 1970s, what spurned and what started a lot of energy centers throughout the US and probably the UK, is standing in line for gasoline, the 1970s oil embargo. On the right, I couldn't find any picture on energy crises at all that are going on in hospitals. My brother is an artist. He wrote this up for me. And this child died because of missing 200 watts of electricity for power. And in the example I gave earlier, it was 80 watts for an oxygen concentrator for the young boy. And so, you know, it's just a discussion that's happening of what do we do? there's an anesthesiologist who wrote with the 2003 blackout in the Northeast that the generator wasn't turning on. There had been some problems. They had backup batteries. He was in the middle of surgery, and the 2003 blackout lasted long enough that people kept coming in and saying, you have to finish the surgery, you have to finish the surgery. And he wrote this case study report, which is very common in medical field, to say, I had no idea what to do once the batteries were dead. And he said, I know everything. Well, not everything, but I know a lot of things is actually what he said. I knew nothing of what I should do, you know? And he said, that needs to change. There should have been ideas, because electricity can fail for a long time. And I will argue, actually, we should be really careful of this as we bring our vehicles into the grid. The buffer for our grid is going to get smaller and smaller unless we build a lot more power plants, or we do other types of systems, integrated smart systems. And then we're gonna start facing this, what is already being faced in low and middle income countries. So how do we go from these types of energy crises? Again, this is the measured load. One of the ways to look at it is to say, one, if patients are dying; two, if it's an avoidable unmet load, i.e. this is suffering, and suffering specifically if it was able to be, if it leads to someone dying. Those are actually real crises. So we're going to talk a little bit about healthcare during electricity failures now, and quantify this a lot more. So this is a paper from PLOS One, and I'm going to focus right here on the energy crises. There are other types of energy systems I've looked at. That's not what we're going to talk about today. This is a paper that surgeons like. So on the left, you have surgeries per 100,000 population from the Lancet Commission on Global Surgeries. Again, on the x-axis, you have average electrical power consumed. This is from the World Bank data, watts per capita. And you can see the countries, the color is the average life expectancy of birth. And the countries that are under 100 watts per person, under human power, are the countries that average life expectancy is quite low. The countries that are above that, there are two groups, one in kind of the orange and yellow, and one in the red. The size of the circles are the population of the country. So you could see India and China. And this is 2012 data. So for surgeons, this is the data they like. Now the engineers like the other, but this is the data that kind of pops out to them. Oh, we want surgeries everywhere. Surgeries not only are going to need water and sanitation, they're also going to need electricity. So what are we looking at for this? So the data doesn't exist. So I reproduced published peer-reviewed paper where they designed energy systems for a healthcare facility, one in Iraq, one in Bangladesh, and I don't have time to go through all of these. It's in another YouTube presentation online if you want to take a look at it. One for Ghana, one for Uganda. The Uganda is actually not reproduced simulations of the design system. This is actually measured values. It's one of the rare measured values of failures at a hospital. So this is the patterns that you can see from the failure types. So one is a diurnal pattern with a little bit of seasonal dry and wet. So when it's been cloudy and rainy, there are more failures associated with that. The two is definitely a seasonal variability. Turns out that's for hydroelectric. The third is more diurnal for nighttime failures. The fourth is random. That's actually the grid failing in the backup diesel. The fifth is load shedding. So some electricity goes to one city and then you fail in the red. You can see it's off half the day. And then you have electricity at night in this example. And then the sixth is the diesel generator failed. So you had no electricity from the grid because the transmission system had been taken down and they were putting in new transmission lines. And then the generator failed on top of it because it overheated. They didn't turn it off. And so it took a month or so to get back the generator at this hospital. So different types of electricity failure patterns. And so you can match them. Every single one of these patterns goes to an actual system. And the system can either be from peer-reviewed data of real systems that they implemented places or from measured values. And And so when we started this other research paper, we said, okay, here's part one, the failures. Part two is we really need to understand the risks associated to patients. So this is the additional risks to a patient when electricity fails. And we don't have data on this either. However, we're collecting the data right now, and we can actually create these types of plots and be able to look at how the risk increases as the time of the failure has increased. So you've started a medical procedure, electricity goes off. If you're in heart surgery, the electricity is off for 10 minutes. The risk of the number of patients that could live for 10 minutes with their chest open, their heart in the middle of heart surgery with the electricity off is something that doesn't exist, but we are in the process of measuring that. Instead of doing it by medical procedure, we're actually doing it by medical ward. So a particular ward would look at all the number of patients they had and how many lived and how many didn't, and then you can look at that risk. So we have different wards, can be in different categories. You have high risk, medium risk is in the green, and low risk is in the blue. You can then look at the entire failure pattern and then embed in it that risk, the additional risk to patients. Then you can look at the entire year and calculate the deaths per 1,000 patients as a statistical value for that year. And so this is just an example of a 2 p.m. to 8 p.m. risk. So you had started a medical procedure at 1 p.m. It went 2 hours, but you didn't get to finish it, or you were in the middle of it and electricity failed for 4 hours. So what is the risk to that patient? It's going to depend on the type of ward they're in, and there's going to be a minimum and maximum that we considered. So here are some of the results from this, from all 4 types that we considered. And these are the deaths per 1,000 patients of risks for the different failure patterns calculated. Now, my colleagues, in the healthcare, public health, global health, they say, we can't read all of these box plots. This is just, no. 50% of our time, our hands are literally in someone's abdomen doing surgery. 50% of the time we're doing surgery, 50% of the time we are doing research, but we need research amplified or able to digest quicker. And so we went back and forth and talking, and we said, you know what, we need to come up with risk plots. So with risk plots, you need to actually start to quantify what's the percentage of medical procedures in each one of these groups. Now there is the group of no impact. Electricity can fail, and it's not going to affect your toe broken or your foot broken. You don't really need electricity for that. So there are medical procedures though that are at risk when electricity fails. So you can also understand how many patients go through that hospital. So once you know how many patients go to that hospital in a year, you know how many medical procedures or the percent that's in the high, medium, and low group, you can start to then model this. Now, there is a way to do the modeling using Bayesian statistics, which is actually the survey data we're collecting. And so this is an example of a plot that could be existed, whether patients lived or died. We haven't done that yet. So the risk charts now, you can have days. So this is severity, the actual chance of patients dying in a day. And then this is the frequency. And so we have 3 different types of risk charts. 1 are in days that you experience this risk. 1 is in deaths per year that you would experience this risk. In this case, you need all of the information that says in there. You need to know confidence level in the 3 risk functions. And the last one, which is most important, is the value of statistical life per electricity shortage. And so that gets at this idea of what is the value of a life worth, back to energy justice. So someone can say, well, this is not based on data. Well, it turns out in Ginger Regional Hospital, they had actually measured there were 150 deaths in 6 months, or 300 deaths in a year, due only to load shedding. So the utility company had to turn off the electricity to this hospital, and people were really upset, and they quantified, they had big meetings and said, was this patient death due to electricity solely? It somehow got leaked before it was published into the newspaper, and there was a huge set of anger from the community, and people started saying, oh, government officials and the utility company started saying the data is fake. Well, I then use this model to back calculate what I showed you and earlier on, and I said there were 45% of the medical procedures. I talked to some people who had worked in places like Ginger Regional Hospital. So 45% of them are high impact, i.e. they're not at a lower ranked medical clinic. So they're really going there for surgeries a lot of times. Is medium impact, so 20%, low impact 20%, and no impact is 15%. And then the hospital is 500 beds, so we estimated 60,833 patients per year. So if you put this into the model, you would then calculate 224 deaths at this hospital within an uncertainty of 138 and 307, which basically tells us that the measurements that they took, that these doctors took, that the government and the utility companies said that it was fake. Actually, we now have a model to show that it could be real. Like this makes sense. And then you can actually change the values. There's a whole set of groups that fit and get you that result. So this model is adaptable, scalable, verifiable. We can actually verify measurements that people take and then try to understand what's going on. Now, what's interesting about this is that you can get the number of days. So a hospital can say, wow, we're going to experience these types of risks, over 100 days. Let's create very specific medical procedures to deal with these risks. You can calculate the number of deaths. So if you know your 500 beds, you know your 80,000 patients per year, you know your energy system type. In this example, we're over 500 deaths in a year. And then you can say, oh, well, what is the value of a statistical life? And so if you take into value of statistical life now, you'll get $123,000 per kilowatt hour, which absolutely is something that people in the energy world, when they're designing a system, do not consider these costs. They do not consider the cost. And we're not talking about the cost of a US life, $6 million. We're talking about the cost, the economic value of statistical life for Iraq, Bangladesh, Ghana, and Uganda. So we have this in the research paper for PLOS One, and the argument is for energy justice and do Black lives matter? When it comes to energy, do Black lives matter? And I would argue that if we're not considering backup to backup energy systems, sustainable risk design, specifically for these types of events, then there is an argument that we haven't considered that their lives matter. And there's an economic cost to this. So there's a lot of different discussions in the research paper we go to. In the US, after Katrina, the family members got $25 million. And they sued the hospital because the generators were put in the basement. CEHURD lodged a human rights complaint against the Ugandan utility company for neglect leading to avoidable suffering in hospitals due to load shedding. Now, they didn't use that language, avoidable suffering. That's the language that I'm using with John Holdren's work. And considering this idea as 3 responses to climate change. Mitigation, we got. Adaptation, we got. What are we doing about suffering in climate change and the impending suffering that is going to increase? What can we avoid? Should we be academically investigating this? And I would say yes, and this is kind of my first introduction to this, talking about these issues. With the paper that I actually looked at, the suffering criteria, everything in red is the suffering. These are avoidable, unmet loads. These are the ways in which we could be meeting those loads, and it would be empowering actually to the community. And I would even argue from a neurological perspective due to trauma. There tends to be more trauma in these areas due to war or other aspects, that there's actually healing that can come from the design and creativity process. And so these are energy justice issues. How do we empower people? I will also argue that because idling generators is incredibly cost prohibitive, upwards of $11 per kilowatt hour, that's an engine math converted from break specific fuel consumption to dollars per kilowatt hour based on the power load in the idling. And you can see it can go upwards of $11 per kilowatt hour. You can easily be making exercise gyms to power. Now, people will say, oh, that's a problem if you really do this on a large scale. And I will argue that T-picking METS kinesiology research that this paper goes through, that is using a lot more energy, a lot more METs in the hot and the heat, and they don't have hardly any breaks. And in an exercise gym, they could be making $5 a day. Tea pickers can make 10 cents, 20 cents a day. So a lot more money in a day in the air conditioning, making electricity for their community. And so, and it would be still expensive, $6 per kilowatt hour. But it potentially could be a game changer in terms of education, making the system, maintaining the system, in terms of empowering economically. Instead of money leaving the community in diesel fuel, now money is able to stay in the community. And so these are things that are not considered, and I think they're not considered due to kind of energy justice. We should be considering these issues. So in terms of the model, going back to wrapping up the model, it's adaptable, scalable, and verifiable in terms of these failures. And we really should be taking data in these failures. We need to be asking the questions that we're currently not asking because we don't necessarily care about those questions. They're not happening to us. They are happening to other people a lot, and we need to be asking these questions and then collecting the data and looking at this. How many patients are dying when electricity fails? There are a lot of different things we go in the research paper in terms of solutions. The one that I like to mention that people don't really talk about is before you start a medical procedure, make sure you have the electricity. And if you're going to do heart surgery or brain surgery, you might want to use a diesel generator, especially if your grid fails often. If most of the batteries in these solar panel systems, there could easily be an app on a cell phone that a surgeon logs into, and they know in general which devices they're using. They can get their kilowatt hours for this particular procedure, given this amount of time. And then they could go, look, do I have that kilowatt hours in the battery right now? That doesn't exist. Patients are dying because we're not even considering or monitoring this. Now, I will also say one thing that colleagues talk about a lot is the disorder associated with the failure. And so one time it's off, then it's off, then it's on, then it's off, then it's on. If you think about the Shannon entropy and a flipping of a coin, on, off, on, off, on, off. If you had to flip a coin every day to say whether or not you had electricity the next hour, very, very stressful, even if you only had to do that 10% of the time. So the entropy is a really good metric for being able to quantify that and to look at that. How close are you to an entropy of 1? So an entropy of 1 is a coin flip. Energy failure based on time or energy shortage isn't good. You look a lot better than you are. So if you were to say how many hours I'm going to run diesel fuel and to go from like say 4 hours to 12 hours of diesel fuel, you don't look so bad. But if you look at entropy and start quantifying these failures from an energy-based metric, you start seeing the disorder that people are experiencing and that they can talk about. And I think it's important to have metrics that really captures what they're talking about. The metric to energy justice is also about asking the questions that are important to the people experiencing it, not asking the questions we think should be asked. And again, I will argue that this idea from anthropologists that we're not objective is something that engineers and scientists should embrace, because it's important to remember and to have humility that I may not be as objective as I think I am. So, energy justice conclusion. Do we include the cost of lives lost in our energy systems and energy costs for designing a system? Currently, no, we do not. But we could, and we would dramatically consider backup to backup energy systems that would increase reliability and value of sustainable risk design with a new paradigm of equality and equity based on energy system research. Also, what does it mean to have a humane level of suffering as it relates to energy? Consider what is avoidable versus unavoidable electricity failures, is what I presented. So that is the talk for today in terms of starting to connect energy justice topics to electricity crisis. Thank you very much. Okay, good, done. I did it. I have no idea. I was not looking at time, but I think I was about an hour.